And today, what we're going to talk about are homeworks 8 and 9, which are primarily multiples assignments. So, assuming that you've watched the video and didn't have any questions, just to briefly review, this would be the multiples file that was on the video. And I had done Procter & Gamble, Clorox, and Estee Lauder. Two tabs. One is the PE multiple, the other is the EV to EBIT multiple and EV to sales multiple. So the key to multiples, as I talked about in the videos, yes?
Do you have that file uploaded on?
Yes, I did. Oh, sorry. This file is available in the files section of Bloomberg. Save you guys time, so you don't have to recreate it yourself. It's in a folder called multiples. And so that's the file that you want that will match the video and to help you do the assignment today. So thank you for pointing that out. All right, so let's go back. So again, multiples are basically an expression of future growth and spread. So what we're doing here for the PE multiple is we're basically backing into a G. Now, again, price to earnings is based on accounting. So we can use the key value drivers, but no plat becomes net income because that's an equity cash flow. The growth is not the growth in the free cash flow or no plat, it's the growth in the EPS or the net income. The ROIC is the expected ROE, return on the equity, and instead of a WACC, we use the cost of equity. But essentially, we can use the same formula. So looking at the observed PE, solving for G's that match, we get these three G's. Okay? And so then the question is, why is Procter & Gamble at the time trading at a premium or discount to Clorox and Estee Lauder? Well, if we look at is trading at a discount to Clorox, primarily because even though it has a slightly higher growth rate, 4% versus 3.7, the real problem is they don't have the spread, okay? And it was the higher spread at Clorox that actually drives the higher multiple. Notice that the net income doesn't affect any of this. It only affects the market cap, okay? So again, income times PE equals value. Sizing is the net income. The PE are the key value drivers. So the point is, why is it trading at a discount to Clorox? Primarily because of lower spread. Why is it trading, why are Estee Lauder and Clorox trading the way they are? Estee Lauder is trading a premium to Clorox because even though it doesn't have as high a spread, it actually has a much higher growth rate because it's the growth spread combination. And by the way, when you get to these ridiculous spreads, and I consider 385% ROE a ridiculous spread. Notice if I make 385% 100%, that almost nothing changes about the PE. So once a company gets past like 20, 30, 40% spreads, growth really matters, right? And if you're not growing that ridiculous spread, you're not going to really get a high PE. And so that's the point. Even though Estee Lauder's spread isn't as high, it's less ridiculous than the Clorox one. Estee Lauder is growing it, and Clorox is not growing it as fast, and that extra growth is actually what's leading to that higher multiple. Okay, so that's what we would explain here. Now, there's one other factor that is basically hurting Estee Lauder's extra growth rate, which is there's two parts to the discount. One is the spread, but the other is the absolute WACC or cost of equity that we're discounting the cash flow based on. Estee Lauder's cash flows are being discounted at 9.4%, Clorox at 8.1%. Watch what happens if Estee Lauder had the same discount rate as Clorox. Their share price would be 50% higher. So I want to state that because there's two things at work when we do multiples. One is the key value drivers, but the other is the fact that we're discounting all these cash flows. So if you have two companies with identical spreads, but one has a lower WACC or cost of capital, the lower WACC or cost of capital is actually going to give them a higher multiple, even if they have the same spreads. And that's kind of what's happening here. In the opposite, which is Estee Lauder's multiple, would be a whole lot higher because they're growing at almost 6% a year. But the problem is, it's being tempered by the fact that they have a much higher risk associated with those cash flows. And so it's not as high as you otherwise would expect it to be. All right, continuing on, tab 2. Again, we have now tax rate, ROIC, and WACC driving our EV to EBIT, solving for G's. And what we see at the top of the page is that basically Procter & Gamble is trading at a discount to Clorox, mainly because even though the lower tax rate should be helping them, and from an operating growth, So remember, the PEG, the growth here, is influenced by growth in net income, which can be manipulated by, for example, how much debt you have in the firm and to some degree the share buybacks. So essentially, this is influenced by financing and cap structure. This EV to EBIT growth is more operating performance, right? Because the EBIT is based on the operating profit of the firm. So that's the point, is that the growth rate of the EPS can be a different growth rate than the operating income, particularly if I'm, for example, buying back a lot of shares and leveraging up the company. So again, when we take out the impact of financing, Procter & Gamble's operations are actually growing a little faster than Clorox. So what really explains why Procter & Gamble's trading at a discount, it's the spread. Very similar growth rates, slightly lower tax rate, but lower spread is why they're trading at a discount. Why is Estee Lauder trading at a discount to Clorox? Interestingly, Estee Lauder has a lot of growth. And Estee Lauder has a pretty similar operating spread to Clorox, not that different, but here's the thing. They have a WACC of almost 9%, and Clorox has a WACC of 7.5%. So what's really causing Estee Lauder to trade at a discount on these enterprise value multiples is not because you would expect what we just talked about PE, that the growth should be multiplying it, but it's not multiplying enough to compensate for the excess WACC. I make the WACC 7.5, they'd have a much higher EV to EBIT. So really, the key to Estee Lauder, which is again why people get confused with multiples sometimes, it's discount rate. Okay? So again, I could easily see somebody naively look at these multiples and say, Estee Lauder is undervalued, okay, given their growth. They have a lot more growth than everybody else, so they should be trading at a higher multiple. And the answer is not necessarily, because there's also some risk that the market is putting on that growth, and that extra risk is kind of tempering that growth, and that's kind of holding back their multiple right now. Now, the final part of this is that we can estimate, and we have done already, an EBIT margin. That's the estimated margin here, which is EV to sales divided by EV to EBIT. And this is the margin, pre-tax margin, operating margin, EBIT margin going forward. And this, again, could be a little distorted because if you look at this, Procter & Gamble has the highest EBIT margin going forward. So they're the most profitable firm, yet they have the lowest multiple. Right? So we're trying to understand why. Why would the most profitable firm? Because our bias would be if you have a higher margin, you should probably have a higher multiple. And the answer is here in the productivity. Margin times productivity equals ROIC. P over S times S over I equals P over I. We've talked about that earlier this semester. Well, here's the deal. We know the margin. We know the tax rate. So therefore, we know our no-plat margin. That's our P over I. And we know our ROIC. So we can connect the two and solve for the productivity. So here's the final part of our multiple analysis. Hidden in the multiples is a guesstimate of the firm's productivity going forward. This productivity is the same productivity that we're back solving for, that if we do a valuation, it's this number off the ROIC tree. So what we're doing is we're using the multiples to back solve for that number. Just like we back solve for G, we can back solve for productivity. Because if we know the margin and we know the ROIC, the productivity is what connects the two. So, say it another way. What is the data telling us? If we look at Procter & Gamble, based on the multiples at the time, they needed to spend $1.07 on capital to generate $1 of sales. Their competitors needed to spend half. So the real other reason why Procter & Gamble is trading at a discount is because they're using twice as much capital to generate the same amount of sales, and that is reducing future free cash flow because they have a much higher reinvestment rate than their peers. Okay, so it's not the gross cash flow that's their challenge, it's the gross investment is higher because they're spending twice as much as their peers. That's what's lowering their ROIC despite the higher margin, and with that lower growth rate, letting them trade at a discount to their peers. So if I'm really looking at Procter & Gamble, it's not about margin. Like the margin expansion is not really what's going to help Procter & Gamble. What's going to help Procter & Gamble is growth and productivity. They need to drive sales without spending more money or doing gigantic acquisitions, and they need to basically fix their balance sheet more than they need to fix their income statement. Okay, That's what I'm starting to see out of this analysis. Questions? Great. So then you're ready to do our next 2 homework assignments. Now I'm going to give you time in class today to do this because in the infinite wisdom of that only you can get at a state school, somebody has decided to close this lab on the weekends. Okay? So we're locking up $300,000 worth of software from the students to actually use to do the academic assignments that they're assigned. Okay? We're trying to undo that right now. I have a friend in the department who's doing a favor. Chuck is trying to call. But again, I don't control the admin gods here at the school who care nothing about what actually happens with students. So somebody made a decision to close this lab. So the lab downstairs is open and crowded, but we're trying to figure out a way to open this room. Now, by the way, if you can get in the room, the lab works. It's just the doors will be locked and there'll be nobody here to let you in. So we're trying to undo that. So that's why I'm giving you time today to get the data for the assignment. And I strongly recommend that even if you don't finish, get your data today so that if you need to do it later, you're not struggling to find a computer open in that lab. And I can't guarantee whether this lab's going to be open or not. We're going to make an appeal and hopefully common sense will prevail. So back to this. Homework 8. I want you to repeat what I did on the video for Procter & Gamble, Clorox, and Estee Lauder. In your case, you're going to do it for Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. That's homework 8. So basically, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, you're going to basically use that template, and I saved you time by giving you the template to basically solve for the G's, right? Both the PEGs and the EV to EBIT Gs, and explain why Raytheon is trading at a premium or discount to Northrop Grumman and or General Dynamics. So basically the same thing I just walked through. You're going to do it with the assignment. The other thing I want you to do is explain the impact of productivity. So just as I showed you that the productivity of Procter & Gamble is much worse because they're spending about twice as much capital was impacting their multiples, I want you to do the same thing. Write that up, minimum 250 words. You don't have to turn in any screenshots because basically we're doing it today, and so our data should be pretty similar anyways. And so essentially you're going to turn in your Excel file and your Word document, and I'm going to give you to Monday 10 a.m., but you're going to have the rest and balance of class time to work on it. Okay, that's homework 8. Here's homework 9. Homework 9 is a little bit harder, though similar. Homework 9 is on Nike. So there's 2 parts to homework 9. Part 1 is you're going to do an as-is valuation of Nike today. You're not going to do a bull, a bear, and a target. You're only going to do the as-is. Okay? And you're going to do a multiple analysis on Nike, Adidas, and Under Armour. You're not going to do a valuation on them. You're just going to do, similar to Raytheon, General Dynamics, and what was the other one? Northrop Grumman. You do the same thing for Nike, Under Armour, and Adidas. Okay? Do the same multiple analysis. But here's the twist. 2 parts to the twist. 1, Under Armour does not have an operating ROIC when you go to Bloomberg. So when you actually redo this assignment, you're going to have to estimate what is a realistic operating ROIC going forward for a firm. So 2 things. You go to the RV screen, and you can look at operating ROIC. Assuming Bloomberg calculates that, the next step is to say, is this representative of the future? Does the past represent the future? If you think it does, you can use the operating ROIC on that screen. And that should work for most of the companies. The reason why I picked General Dynamics, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, not much is changing about those defense contractors. So it's a pretty safe bet you could use the operating ROIC today to reflect the future. Now, mixing metaphors. Tonight is the last night of my online MBA class. They're doing their final presentations. One of the teams was working on Halliburton, and they were struggling with Halliburton because the operating ROIC of Halliburton was very low, but the multiple analysis suggests it should be very high. And they're just like, help. Okay, so here's the translation. That operating ROIC that you calculated in Bloomberg is historical. It's from 2018. Well, oil prices in 2018 were a lot lower than oil prices in 2019. So a business that's sensitive to oil prices is going to have a better spread going forward with higher oil prices than with lower oil prices. And that's what the team stumbled across as they were trying to do this analysis. So I'm giving you a hint that basically says sometimes you can use the operating ROIC and say it doesn't change, so I don't have to change it. And sometimes you might actually have to estimate it differently if something fundamental is changing about that business. Okay? And then here's the third scenario, which will happen to you for Under Armour. Bloomberg can't calculate it. So you're going to do an RV, you're going to type in the operating ROIC, and you're going to see a blank for Under Armour. So then what do? Well, basically, you got to go to the model. So you export Under Armour's data, you stick it into our model, and 5 minutes later, you get an operating ROIC. Because at the end of our tree, and in the forward CFI tabs, we're forecasting ROIC that's operating. So for Under Armour, that's the extra step that you'll need to do as part of that assignment. So here's the other step, is that, and our model has not done this to date. So this is the other big change for this assignment. And I'll show you as an example with Halliburton. I've told you all semester long on the ratios tab to leave the balance sheet ratios alone. Okay? I basically said, don't worry about the balance sheet ratios. They'll just auto forecast for us because everything's a percentage of sales. Well, here's the thing. What if the productivity is changing for a firm going forward? And what is the realistic productivity the market expects? Well, here's the thing. When you did your multiple analysis, you know what the productivity of the firm needs to be. So just as we know what the EBIT margin needs to be, we now know what the productivity needs to be. So rather than just let the balance sheet run, we can basically adjust the balance sheet to get a more realistic productivity. Now again, I'm mixing up companies here, so just think of this as a process example. But let's say this was Halliburton. It's not, but this was Halliburton, and the number was 1.07. So I go to Halliburton, and I'm not saying you have to put it here, but here's an example. I go to my ratios. I have my productivity, which is IC to sales. What is IC to sales? Equals off the TFI, invested capital, divided by revenue. So in 2013, 0.69. Copy, paste. Copy, copy, paste. Here's the deal. This perpetuity number should be that perpetuity number. I'm 10% off in the balance sheet. So how do I adjust it? Well, if you think about it, what gets me lower invested capital? To be honest with you, the model doesn't care. But what I could do is I could lower my, for example, net fixed assets from 37% to, I don't know, 30% or 29%, 28%. Now I'm matched. So this is something we hadn't matched before. But now I want you to match it. And you can either change inventory, receivables, or PP&E. But the whole point is we got to forecast a balance sheet. And I'll give you another mixed metaphor. When we did Yum, one of the things that happened about Yum is we showed you how Yum was taking company-owned stores and franchising them, basically getting rid of a lot of capital. But they still had some franchise, or still had some company-owned stores that were not franchised. So one of the questions we did not address in Yum was whether or not the market believes Yum was going to get rid of the rest of those franchises. We could have actually used the multiple analysis to answer that question. Because by finishing the multiple analysis on Yum with this template, we could have looked at what the productivity had to be given the trading multiples. And then we could have compared that against our valuation model to see whether or not it was a margin improvement for Yum or whether or not their productivity was going to improve as we forecasted the out years. It's an extra step we skipped. That's a step you're going to do with Nike. Okay? So what you're going to look at when you do your Nike evaluations, you're going to do everything that we did. But before you do those final 3 steps of doing the final revenue growth rates, you're going to look at that productivity to make sure you don't have to adjust the balance sheet, right? And if you do adjust the balance sheet to match the productivity in the perpetuity here. Then put in your sales growth. Okay. So essentially, that's the additional step. You'll turn that in as a paper with 500 words as opposed to 250 words. Both due Monday, both individual. Questions? All right, I'm going to give you the balance of time in class today. I'm here to answer questions. Again, both assignments due Monday, 10 a.m. We'll debrief both on Monday.
What about PE? That's all.